Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be going uh, pretty dark, I guess you could say,
Yeah, a little bit.
but, fascinating nonetheless. We're diving into the world of serial killers. Based on an article from Psychology Today, you shared that you're looking to gain knowledge really quickly and thoroughly, which I think is something we all want. And I think this topic is really going to be interesting to explore in that context.
Absolutely. It's something that obviously can be very disturbing, very frightening, but there's a reason why people are so fascinated by it. There's a reason there are so many, documentaries and movies and books and podcasts even devoted to this. And I think that speaks to a certain, fascination, but also a desire to kind of understand something that seems so outside the bounds of normal human behavior.
Right. Yeah. And I think our mission today, I guess you could say, is to pull out the most crucial insights from this Psychology Today article for you. And, without necessarily getting lost in the weeds of some of the really, really disturbing details, we're aiming for understanding more than just like a recounting of horrors.
Exactly. So we want to look at what actually defines a serial killer. What are the sort of psychological landscapes that could shape the actions of a serial killer? And, ultimately, why do these figures, despite the fear, the profound fear that they inspire, hold such a prominent place in our collective consciousness?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think, there's a lot to unpack there. So maybe to kind of get us started, can we just define, like right off the bat, when we're talking about a serial killer, that's the definition we should all be working with?
Yeah. So the accepted definition, and the one that Psychology Today uses in this article, is someone who has murdered at least 3 people, and these killings take place over a period of more than a month, so not all at once. And the other really critical element here is that there are cooling off periods between these acts. So it's not like a continuous rampage. There's a pause. There's a time in between. And that's actually a key characteristic.
Yeah, that cooling off period makes it seem almost cyclical, right? Like there's a pattern there. And I know the article also mentions that some experts add another kind of layer to the definition. It goes beyond just the number of victims and the time frame.
That's right. So some experts argue that the definition should also include this idea of a deviant psychological motive. So it's not just simply the act of murder, but there's something else that's kind of driving these crimes, whether that is, sexual gratification or a need for dominance or some other kind of unusual psychological urge.
So it's not just the act itself, but the psychological needs that act's fulfilling. Now, just for clarity's sake, because I know these terms can sometimes get blurred together. Can we just like clearly distinguish between a serial killer and a mass murderer, just so we're all on the same page?
Absolutely. So while both involve, the tragic loss of multiple lives, the key distinction really lies in the timing and the nature of the events. So serial killings, as we talked about, unfold over time with those distinct breaks between each incident. Mass killings, on the other hand, are characterized as these brief, singular events where multiple people are killed at once. And they use the example in the article of like a school shooting. So obviously horrific event, but it would be classified as a mass murder and not serial killing because there's no cooling off period.
Right. So it really comes down to that element of time and those intervals between the killings. So,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously this isn't a new phenomenon, right? Like instances of people committing multiple murders have probably, been going on throughout history.
Yeah.
But, were these kinds of things, how was repeated violence like this understood
Yeah.
in earlier times?
Right. You made a really good point, which is that we can kind of assume that people who would meet our modern definition of a serial killer have probably existed for centuries.
Right.
But the way we categorize and understand these crimes is a more recent development. So in earlier periods, these kinds of terrifying events were often attributed to forces beyond human comprehension. They would be attributed to supernatural entities like monsters or werewolves or even witchcraft.
Wow.
Yeah. And even when perpetrators were apprehended, they might actually, their explanations for their actions might actually involve these supernatural claims.
So like they would blame it on a werewolf or something?
Right. It's really interesting to think about that, how people understood these things in a time when there wasn't a framework to understand it in a human psychological context.
Right. So it's almost like the concept of a human being, however disturbed, committing these kinds of acts was just not something that people could really process.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the article brings up Jack the Ripper, who, I think most people are at least somewhat familiar with. Where does he kind of fit into this historical timeline of serial killing?
So Jack the Ripper, who terrorized London in the late 19th century, is often considered to be the first modern serial killer.
Mm.
Obviously the term wasn't used at the time, but his crimes, a series of distinct, brutal killings, and they exhibited a clear pattern. So he kind of marked this shift towards recognizing these as potentially linked acts by a single individual.
So he's like a marker, but not necessarily the beginning.
Exactly. And it's interesting because the term serial killer itself really gained momentum much later, really starting to take hold in the latter half of the 20th century. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is obviously increased media coverage, so these kinds of crimes were getting more attention, but also because law enforcement techniques were advancing. So agencies were starting to develop more sophisticated ways of recognizing patterns and connections between seemingly unrelated murders, sometimes across jurisdictions.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating how just the act of naming something can kind of change our perception of it. And, it seems like the article is suggesting that the fact that we focus so much on serial killers in the 20th and 21st century isn't necessarily because there were suddenly a lot more of them. It's just that we were better at identifying them and categorizing them.
That's exactly right. And, while certain Western countries, particularly the U.S., tend to have a higher number of identified serial killers, it's believed that that's probably more a reflection of, intense media scrutiny and the advanced law enforcement capabilities rather than an actual geographical disparity.
Right.
So I think it's safe to say that serial killers have likely been present across, most countries on 6 continents throughout history.
So it's not like an American thing or a modern thing or anything like that. It's just a human thing.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So we've kind of laid the groundwork of what defines a serial killer, and a little bit of the historical context. So let's get into what I know you were particularly interested in, which is the psychology behind this. So the article mentions severe antisocial tendencies
Mm-hmm.
as being like kind of a primary factor here.
Yeah.
So can you break that down a little bit for us? What does that really mean?
Sure. So while the exact motivations, as we said, can be, incredibly complex and unique to each individual, this underlying thread of severe antisocial behavior is really, really consistent. These individuals often exhibit this profound lack of empathy, which is, the inability to understand or share the feelings of others. They typically don't show any remorse for their actions, and they have this blatant disregard for laws, social norms, the rights of other people. And the article also talks about this potential undercurrent of revenge, whether that's directed at specific individuals or even just like a broader sense of resentment towards society as a whole.
So it's almost like their internal moral compass is just totally like broken.
Yeah, or maybe it never developed properly in the first place. And that kind of brings us to the question of mental illness, right? So are all serial killers legally insane? And I think this is a really crucial distinction that the article makes, which is that while some serial killers may indeed exhibit symptoms of psychosis, or they might have been diagnosed with something like bipolar disorder, the vast majority don't actually meet the legal criteria for insanity. And, legal insanity has this very specific definition. It really hinges on an individual's capacity to understand the nature of their actions and whether they knew right from wrong at the time of the crime.
So even though their behavior is very clearly disturbed, and horrific in many cases, they still have like an awareness of what they're doing, at least on some level.
Exactly.
And the article talks about psychopathy and sociopathy, and how do those concepts relate to serial killers?
Right. So it's been found that a significant portion of serial killers display characteristics that are consistent with psychopathy or sociopathy. And these are conditions that, often fall under the umbrella of antisocial personality disorder. And, as we discussed, the core features of that, like the lack of empathy, the absence of remorse, the disregard for others, those are central to these concepts.
So I guess, the image that we often see, especially in like movies and TV shows, of a serial killer as this like evil genius, That might actually be pretty far from reality in most cases. What does the Psychology Today article say about like intelligence levels?
Yeah, I think popular culture really likes to depict them as these masterminds, these criminal geniuses.
Hmm.
We think of like Hannibal Lecter from, Silence of the Lambs, these almost like superhumanly intelligent figures. But the truth is, as the article points out, the majority of serial killers actually have average IQs. Their intelligence really falls across the spectrum, much like the general population.
Okay.
So some have lower IQs, a few might have unusually high intelligence, but the most common range is really right there in the middle.
So again, not necessarily something that sets them apart.
Yeah, it really breaks down that stereotype.
Right. Yeah. So let's talk about the nature versus nurture debate. Does the article give us any insight into like the combination of factors that might lead someone down this path to becoming a serial killer?
So they really emphasize the complexity of this question, and they point out that a very significant number of serial killers have documented histories of, abuse or neglect or trauma in childhood. So that obviously suggests a strong role for environmental factors, but at the same time, it also notes that antisocial personality disorder, which, as we said, is frequently observed in serial killers, that has shown genetic links. So it seems to suggest that there's this potential biological predisposition as well.
Oh, interesting.
So it's probably this really complex interplay between innate tendencies and environmental influences that ultimately contribute to this outcome.
So it's not just one or the other. It's this kind of toxic combination maybe where a difficult childhood might kind of amplify some pre-existing vulnerability. Are there any like early warning signs that the article brings up?
Yeah, so as you might guess, a history of trauma or neglect is really common. And some individuals also show, early patterns of delinquent behavior. The article also points to this thing called the McDonald triad, which you might have heard of. It's this triad of behaviors observed in childhood: animal cruelty, fire setting, and bedwetting.
Wow. Okay.
So it's not like, foolproof predictor. It's not universally present, but its presence has been noted as a potential indicator.
So it's something to be aware of, but not necessarily something to freak out about if you see a kid, wetting the bed.
Right.
Okay. So the article goes on to kind of categorize serial killers based on their motivations. Can we get into those different types?
Sure. So they outline four main categories. The first is what's known as the visionary serial killer. And these are the ones who operate under the belief that they're receiving instructions from a higher power to commit these acts. So they might be experiencing, symptoms of schizophrenia or a psychotic break, which is obviously very disturbing.
Yeah. So there's a very direct link to mental illness there potentially.
In many cases, yes.
Okay.
The second type is the mission-oriented serial killer. And these are people who feel that they have a specific duty to rid the world of certain types of people, people they deem undesirable. So they might target, for example, sex workers, believing that they're carrying out some kind of, necessary extermination.
So they feel like they're doing the world a favor in a very twisted way.
Right, exactly. Then we have the hedonistic serial killer, and as you might guess, these individuals derive pleasure or gratification from the act of killing itself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And this can manifest in different ways. It might be sexually driven, or it could just be purely thrill-based, the craving for the intense experience of taking a life.
Okay. So it's not always sexual, but it's always about that feeling of power, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And then the last type is the power control serial killer. And for these individuals, the main motivating factor is this need to dominate and exert control over their victims. So the act of taking a life is really the ultimate expression of this need for power.
So we've got the religious zealot type. We've got the almost like vigilante type. We've got the sadist type, and then we've got the control freak type.
Right. You could kind of break it down like that.
Okay, so I know one of the myths that the article specifically addresses is that all serial killers are men. So can you talk a little bit about female serial killers?
Absolutely. And, this is really important to clarify. While the majority of, well-known serial killers are indeed male, women definitely commit these types of crimes as well.
Okay.
And estimates suggest that they make up somewhere around 15% of all serial killers.
Oh, wow. That's not an insignificant number.
Not at all. And I think part of part of the reason why we have this, perception that it's exclusively a male phenomenon is because of these deeply ingrained societal stereotypes,
Yeah.
the idea that women are nurturing, that they're less prone to violence.
Yeah.
It's
Oh,
just not accurate.
right, right. So, I mean, 15% is a pretty significant portion. Are there any, like, typical differences in the way that female serial killers tend to operate? Like, are their motivations different or their methods?
So yeah, the article does actually highlight some key distinctions. One is that female serial killers are often less motivated by sexual urges, and financial gain appears to be a much bigger factor for them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they also tend to use different methods. So, for example, poison is statistically much more common among female serial killers, which, perhaps is perceived as a less overtly violent method than, shooting or stabbing or strangulation.
Mm.
And then also the article points out that women who engage in serial killing are more likely to act in concert with a male partner.
Okay.
So, they might be in this kind of like manipulative role or enabling role. And the article actually gives the example of Karla Homolka and Myra Hindley, where, you have these women who are working alongside, male partners in these crimes.
So it's not just a male thing at all.
Right.
Okay, so we've talked about the definition, the psychology behind it, the various motivations, the gender dynamics. Now, let's talk about this kind of uncomfortable aspect of it, which is, why are we so fascinated by these people? Like, why do they have such a hold on our collective imagination? These gruesome crimes, it seems like people are just drawn to it.
Yeah. And, the article talks about this a lot. And I think despite how repulsive these acts are, they do evoke this mixture of fear, but also fascination. And I think that explains why there's just so much media, books, TV shows, podcasts, movies dedicated to the subject.
So what is it like psychologically that makes us so interested in uh, this really dark side of human nature?
Well, I think there are a few things. First of all, evolutionarily speaking, our brains are kind of hardwired to pay attention to danger and threats, right? It's a survival mechanism. So, when we're interested in serial killers, it kind of taps into that. Also, I think true crime in general can provide this kind of like a vicarious thrill. You get that heightened emotion, that excitement, but it's from a safe distance. You're not actually in danger.
Right, right. So it's like a safe way to experience something terrifying.
Exactly. I think also the fact that, as we talked about, these people often appear to be outwardly normal, until their crimes are discovered. That can be very unsettling.
Yeah.
And it makes us want to figure out, like, what are the signs? Can we identify these people, to protect ourselves? And then there's also the idea that this fascination might be a way for us to safely explore, the darker thoughts and urges that, to some degree probably exist in all of us.
Right. So it's like a way to confront the darkness without actually having to experience it directly.
Exactly. And by trying to understand the seemingly inexplicable, it can make us feel a little bit safer, like we have a little bit more control.
Right, right. So so the article talks about some common myths surrounding serial killers, and we already talked about, the evil genius myth and the myth that it's only men. Are there any other myths that the article kind of debunks?
Yeah. So another common one is that, serial killers are always these dysfunctional loners, right? They're totally isolated from society. But the truth is that a lot of them actually manage to maintain seemingly normal lives. They have families, they have jobs, they appear to be well-adjusted members of their community.
Right, which is, I mean, that's almost more frightening in a way, right?
Exactly. And that's part of why it's so captivating, this idea that this darkness can reside behind this this kind of facade of normalcy.
Yeah, yeah, that's scary. Okay, so the article also gets into this I don't know, even more extreme side of this fascination, which is people who form relationships with convicted serial killers. What are the motivations there?
Yeah, it's really fascinating and disturbing at the same time. So Some people who do this claim that they have this desire to nurture the serial killer or to understand them, and they often point to, the serial killer's history of abuse as kind of like a justification.
Yeah.
But, experts offer a lot of different explanations for this. Some suggest that these individuals might themselves be, unstable, or maybe they have this kind of like fanatical desire for notoriety, by being associated with this infamous person. But there are also some theories that are even more complex and potentially even evolutionary. Yeah, and these theories, they kind of suggest this distorted manifestation of a desire for a powerful mate. It's
Right.
like this need for dominance taken to this really extreme level.
Yeah, it's really hard to understand, from our perspective. But I guess it makes sense that there would be some kind of deep-seated psychological explanation for it.
Mm.
So finally, the article looks at the impact of serial killers on society as a whole. Like how do their actions and our understanding of them affect us?
Well, I mean, the most immediate impact is obviously the fear, right? It creates this sense of fear and distrust within communities where these crimes take place. And that often leads to, increased police presence, new laws, and just this general sense of unease and suspicion. Um, but the article also talks about this interesting sociological theory, which suggests that, serial killers, by their very nature, they're kind of reinforcing societal boundaries of good and evil, Like their extreme deviance kind of helps us define what's normal and what's acceptable.
So in a way, they're helping us to define our own sense of morality, even though it's in this really twisted, indirect way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of a disturbing thought, but it highlights the complex ways in which these figures can affect us.
Yeah, yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about the definition of a serial killer, the psychology behind it, uh, the different motivations, the gender dynamics, the fascination that they hold for us, and I think the Psychology Today article really brings to light some important things that we should all be aware of.
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways is that, it's important to remember that, this is not just something that we see in movies, right? This is a real phenomenon, and it's much more complex than we often think. The fact that their intelligence levels are all over the map, that women are just as capable of these crimes, and that there's this whole, range of motivations. I think those are really important things to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think the exploration of our own fascination with serial killers is also really important, even if it's a little uncomfortable,
Yeah.
because it tells us something about ourselves, right?
Mm.
It tells us about our need to understand the unknown, our need to deal with fear and darkness.
Exactly.
So I think hopefully this has given our listeners a better understanding of this really complex and disturbing subject.
Absolutely.
So, as always, we like to leave our listeners with something to think about. And, based on what we've talked about today, I guess the question is, how do you think all of this attention, all of this media coverage, the books, the movies, the TV shows, how do you think that shapes our broader perception of crime? And how does it affect our understanding of the justice system and maybe even our ideas about evil itself?
Right. It's a really interesting question. And I think it speaks to the fact that there's this complex interplay between, the reality of these crimes and then the narratives that we create around them.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. It's a lot to think about, but as always, we appreciate you joining us for the deep dive,
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
and we'll see you next time.